Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. Today's discussion is going to be on how you can leverage Azure Government and GCC High in order to help make your applications compliant with both CMMC and FedRAMP High. As a note, our webinars are structured with an open Q&A at the end, which is not shared on YouTube, in order to make a more open forum for everybody. We will be recording this Q&A session in order to enable better follow-up for more technical questions. And with that said, I'll pass it over to Agile IT's CEO, Conrad Egermont.
All right, hey everybody. Thanks for joining this webinar. I was really eager to have this particular discussion. There's we have just a number of customers that both are, looking to do things in their GCC High tenant, and as well as a lot of ISV and SaaS vendors that we've worked in the past, and a lot of common questions. So we thought we'd put this out there and see where we can get the conversation, really going. When we think about this, again, for those that maybe haven't been with us before, we really just focus on the Microsoft Cloud service, but really our vision is to, be open and honest with our customers and share experiences and really build that trust and be trustworthy with them and, as well with Microsoft. And every day and why we have this session and we work with our customers in advisor programs and deployments is really, and which leads in well into this webinar, how do you get the most out of the investments that you've made in there? You could be in commercial. In this one, we're specifically focused on the CMMC, GCC High, and FedRAMP side of it. And, reason why a lot of people are probably here, in this particular session is, one, you may have your own internal applications that you've maybe previously created in commercial and trying to figure out what are the things that we need to do in the GCC High world. Which is key. Maybe you're trying to go for certification or whatever that might be. You're providing services to the DoD directly as consumers, or through other contractors, whatever that might be. But and there's many times when you're modernizing applications, those that may have migrated to Microsoft 365, in GCC High, have an Azure Government environment, but we have these applications that we built in whatever flavor you have, whatever OS that you're on, and you're trying to change it from, we used to have username and passwords as a form field, as there's still many of them around. We want to use Azure AD, or we were doing against local Active Directory, and now we want to do it against Azure AD because there's a reason why we went into GCC High, and it was because we wanted to not only pass an audit, but we might have ITAR requirements that have to be on there. When we're going to go through an audit, we want to leverage the shared responsibility that Microsoft has. And so, that's why we're there. So we need to also modernize or change our applications to use the same identity that we have. And so what are the things that we have to be mindful of and look at? So hopefully at the end of this, you'll kind of get some of the key points that you're looking for. And a lot of ISVs, there's a lot of customers that we worked with that, they built applications, did it, either direct integration or did some SAML. I'll talk about that lightly, integration with Azure AD. But in order for them to support those same customers that have moved into this GCC High space, some things are going to be different, which I'll cover some of them. And there's some really, really important things to note, both if you're a customer that's going to consume some of those services, or as an ISV, as you're going to provide services to those customers, of key architectural decisions you have to make or ask about as you get that integration. Because there's been a lot, in the news and in the communities and the marketplace around, hijacking tokens, or, hey, what happens if I use this if I have this application and what do I have to be mindful of security? So I'm not going to go over all of the in depth, but I'm going to cover quite a bit. So hopefully it helps out. And one thing just to note, because there's one of the reasons why there's a lot of vendors that are going into requiring to get their own GCC High tenant is because it is Microsoft's one of the things that they've been doing really, really good on, because they've been doing this for years, but it's because they've invested so much to make sure that in their Azure Government environment, specifically here we're talking about GCC High, there's a lot of applicability to DoD, to that particular tenant, but to be able for them to pass the audit, so they can pass the audit with you when it's time. So while you're here, and maybe you're just curious to some of these areas, and here's the kind of quick summary, but I'm going to different pieces of this and some other recommendations that's not on this list, but you're thinking, why do I hang out here? Well, it's because, part of the thing is that when you're going through this, we're going to talk about SAM a little bit, but a lot of this is around OAuth-based authentication directly with Azure AD, integration with the graph, because many of your applications, sometimes it's basic. I just want to be able to have people go into it and see their name, and then I can capture their info, and my application does the rest on the database and background. But there's many times there's more things that you want to go do. Maybe it's because of the workflows or applications you want to create, and you want to be able to know what groups they're a member of. Maybe you're creating an admin portal so you can help manage users and onboard them, provide guidance or recommendations. Maybe you're creating an application that's actually going to drive some of your process that's CUI based, and you could still be using things like Power Platform and Flow or Logic App, but you're also doing which actually, by the way, leverages many of these pieces we're going to talk about to be mindful of. But maybe there's things I have coders that are doing C# or something else. So anyway, there's lots of things that you have to consider when you go through this. And one thing is that not all the data is CUI data. You may be in that environment that the customers have because you're providing HR support services. Is that all CUI data? I'm going to tell you first off, I'm not an auditor. Our company doesn't do audits. We're not the one that's going to get you across the finish line for that, but we're the implementers that kind of guide and make sure you're doing the right things for whatever it is. And we always say you have to talk to your program office. What is in the contract? And so some areas that you might have, like let's say it's sales, and have a sales tool or have a guidance tool that as a third party, I want to integrate with GCC High. Now that doesn't mean that I don't have to care about those things. But you have to ask a lot of questions, because if the customer slips CUI data in, then you're kind of in it. We'll talk about scoping things accordingly as we go through. So anyway, we're going to go through some of these areas and give some recommendations as we go through. So first off, and I'm going to cover some of these details as we move along, but here are the key things that I would look for in terms of your planning. Super basic, but one of the things that changes in terms of the endpoints, and you'll see this in the next slide, hey, we were doing integration with the graph. Now it's something different. And it seems like it's not a big deal. And to some degree, it's not, except many times if you have a legacy applications, sometimes we hardwire those things in. And we expect them to come in. And and normally they hide themselves in terms of authentication and authorization. If you did a good job putting it in your config files, that's great if you've already developed an application, but you got to double check it. So testing is going to be key on here if you're somebody who and there are customers that actually that maintain 2 tenants. We have 25% of our business in government, so we need to have that space. But we have 75% of our other business that we don't have that. So because of cost or scale or separation concerns, we actually maintain 2 separate tenant types. And in that case, well, what happens if you want to build an application that can do both? I'll cover that a little bit and some of the things to think about, but you can't do that, but you still have to have those different tenants, and your application has to understand how to split those if you did want to do something like that. The other part is just how do we scope it down to make sure we're only getting the things that we need. And I'll talk about each one of these a little bit more, but these are the areas that at the very beginning, takes a lot of testing, validating, where does the data go, those sorts of areas. But this is a place that if you don't spend enough time and just say, it's just a different endpoint. It's login.microsoft.us instead of .com. What's the big deal? You'll find out here in a little bit. So those are the quick ones to look at. So first off, and I provide a link here at the bottom. Pretty simple to see that for Azure AD, and that's the thing. We talk about Azure Commercial, which is also Azure, Global Services. So this is the traditional, portal.azure.com, stick in a credit card, pay Agile IT to do licensing, whatever. This is the endpoint that your applications are going to look for. One is the portal where you log into, and the other one is the endpoint. Now, the endpoint is important because even though Azure AD has these 2 different endpoints, there's more that goes to that story in terms of multi-tenant versus single tenant, and I might be able to show something about that as well. But first part is this: there's lots of other places in terms of the graph that has other endpoints for the blob storage, other endpoints for the virtual machines. There's lots, but Well, right now we're talking really around the identity part of it. So I kind of just scoped it to this, that you have to be mindful of when you do things like registration and consent. So one thing to make note of is when you have an application, and I'll talk a little bit about this in terms of doing the registration part of it, but there's really two kind of categories of scope. There's delegated and there's application permission. So when we create an app registration, when we say we're building a new application, my application is going to need to be able to do things. Well, the first part is you can say, well, if the doing things means when a user logs in, that we're going to provide, let's say, a UI, and there'll be other talks that talks about different ways you can do this on the server side. To do it that way. There's also on the client side. If you're using the client libraries, or a really good one is the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. Really cool things that they have in there. Either way, what level of access does the application have when it's doing things? So the first part is delegate. So if your application says I'm going to do user read or even user read write, what it means is that when I have the application that has this scoping, right? So we register, we say this is the scoping we want, and it's been approved. I'll cover that in a little bit. That the application is going to do things on behalf of the user. So it's going to say, oh, since Conrad has logged in and I have been scoped out to do with these permissions, I can only see and do things based off of what the logged in person has. So this is delegated permissions. You're essentially saying the application go ahead and do things based off the user that's logging in. So even though the application runs as a service principal, it's only going to do that. Application permissions are different because a user, in this case, I may want a user to log in. And again, I'm not saying this is the right way to architect, just it creates a clear example. And I want a user to log in, and I want to be able, the application wants to be able to list all of the users and its properties, maybe even more, and maybe even change those properties, even though the user themselves don't have that right. Now, a scenario why you may want to do that is because, well, I don't really want to give that person the right to do that in Azure Active Directory, let's say, because I want to use an application so I can do maybe other approvals. I have another kind of process, naming patterns, maybe it's onboarding a new user or offboarding a user. And so going through the application allows me to say, I can have the user put in the request, take some actions, and then now that the application has the rights to do it, they can take that action on the back end. Now, the ability to scope that and manage that is a whole nother topic, but this is really when you think of, well, a user can log in, I validate you, I know you are Conrad, and now my application, who's being consented by the IT department or whomever, said yes, the application can do this, it's fine because it controls it, audits it, and has a whole flow. So this allows the user to be able to get that experience and the application supported, yet they don't have the direct access if they were to go around the system. So it's a nice way of being able to create that. But you really have to be mindful of what level of access, because you don't want everybody to have that. And does the application always need to go do that, which is kind of a separate topic. But this is part of the planning of when should we do things, and you can mix them around of when you're going to do things, when you're going to do things with a application kind of permission versus when you're going to do a delegate. So you can control that in code. So it's not like, hey, let's just do application, do everything there. You really should limit it in terms of what you're going to do and when. So let's take one example of an internal application. And I made it very simple here what you're going to go do. One thing in terms of a topic to really talk about is if you look inside of Azure Active Directory and we go into the portal and we look at the different types of services that they have here. So I'll just drag over here a little bit of info. That might be too much info. But so when you're inside of Azure Active Directory, you'll be able to see there's two areas. One is enterprise applications, and the other one is app registration. They're related, but they're not exactly the same thing. So essentially, let's talk about SAML. So first off, if you were, let's say we do SAML all the time. We have like HubSpot or Salesforce, and we tie that in. And what you normally do is an administrator who has, application administrative rights or global admin rights. There's only a few that are allowed to go do this. They can go in enterprise application and go, oh, look, there's HubSpot. And in there, there's a lot of times in the market, in the documentation marketplace for Azure AD, it'll have many of the components in there, but there's still some work. You got to go into, let's say, HubSpot per se, in order to get the right key and copy that back into Azure AD in the enterprise applications area. Then it gives me a key and I paste it over there. So this is kind of sharing our secrets or certificates both ways. And then I get to set my claims of what users can do, what we pass in terms of roles or whatever those is. And now we have login authentication. Great, SAML, does all those things. So that's one way that you could do it, and it resides in enterprise applications. The other one, the one that we're going to focus most of it here, is on app registration. So in app registrations is a place where you get to define an application that you plan to use and code against, and you're going to tell what kind of scopes you want. Who are the people in the roles? What are the role types? What are the kind of consents that we're going to accept and go do? And that's kind of the beginning of where you'd have it. So you define your app registration here, because you can put other areas. Is it a multi-tenant or a single tenant application? Are we going to support mobile and desktop, or just web clients? Are we going to do single page applications, SPA apps, which requires different kind of token flow and all that? We're not going to go into all those details. So maybe if more people comment, we can go get a deeper session in the future. Anyhow, once you define what that app registration is, you configure your app service. Here's an app service. Well, what if it's a server that's on-prem or my desktop and developing? Yes, you can configure those. But in this example, I'm going to say it's an app service. I've written it in .NET, running on, doing .NET 7, running on Linux. It's an app service that's there, and all is great. So now I've wired up the application, and when I first run the application, I've only done app registration, and now it's going to go to authenticate and now get the scopes that I've defined, whether it's for users and groups. There's a ton of stuff you can do, SharePoint, Exchange, whatever. Now I have to consent for it. Now, if you're just an application developer and you put it in, you may not have the rights to go do that. And we're going to have a follow-up webinar that talks about how to manage this so it doesn't go crazy. But once you consent, wherever the admin consents for that, then an enterprise application gets created. So they're related. Why are they different? You'll find out in a little bit longer. So app registration is where I get to define this. This is where I say, when I get that, one of the things that I need is the client ID, which it gives me. That client ID is also the same in enterprise applications. It's a sneaky little thing. If you're doing conditional access policies, something you have to kind of look for, something we work with our customers, we do reporting. Anyhow, it's the same client ID, but one is an application registration, the other one's is a service principal that they have there. I'm not going to go into those deep topics. Anyway, pretty simple. Create the registration. Here's what I want, because I have an application that I'm going to integrate with, and now I have to consent that says, yes, we consent now, and people can see it in my apps if it's been assigned to them. We can define the roles and all that. If I change anything in the app registration, because let's say I wanted to change what scopes I want to allow, then I have to reconsent the application. It's not a duplicate. It'll know which one's there and it'll consent. So internal application, this gets me started. If I'm doing, the same kind of process is in commercial, global, or, in GCC High. And so this kind of gets you started. Now your application is there. Now when people log in, they're going to log in with their Azure AD credentials, which means now we can make sure, we're tracking it with log analytics. We can do conditional access to start managing and constricting things, some more guidance on that later on. Now we're all wired up, GCC High, everything's great. But again, it's going to go to login at Microsoft.us. When we call the graph endpoints, we have to call the right graph endpoint that's specifically in the Azure Government or GCC High space, that you're calling. So pretty simple. Now, where things get a little bit interesting here is now let's talk about it, from an ISV perspective. Now, if you're only thinking about doing internal applications, you may go, well, this is too much for me. But as a consumer of these applications, you really should kind of follow along as we go through this. Now, in this kind of environment, we have two sets of spaces here. We have the commercial space here at the bottom, and then the government one up top. And by the way, this can be company A on the left and vendor one on the right, consuming all those services. And like I said, I'll talk a little bit about how you can mix this, not to say that it's what you want to go do, but now some things become different. On the vendor side of it, they can create an app registration that's specifically for their application. Now, one thing to note, if you're a vendor that has a commercial tenant today, you're already doing this integration today, and you go, hey, can I just, point to, log in at Microsoft.use in order to, have the users that are over here. Let me get a little fancy pen here. The customers that are in this tenant, can I just point the app registration to there and have it work? No, it won't work. And the reason it won't work is that the app registration client ID, which is unique to your application, and I will talk about how that can be shared across multiple tenants, will only be valid in the global space. It won't work in the GCC high space. They are different. If you did redirect them, the person will log in, and then it'll say, hey, you need to certify this, and then it'll fail because it'll say, I can't find the client ID. And that's because when it's trying to do the consent for that app registration in the customer's tenant, it's not in that GCC High Azure Government space, so it will fail. So what this means is in order to support the application, you'd have to have a tenant yourself and the client ID registered here, and this is the one that the registration and consent will happen. So for this example, there are two separate zones. We have maybe one customer who has two tenant types, and we're one vendor, we have two tenant types. And in this example, there'd be a client ID that you would, I'm sorry, I put that wrong here. Well, actually, this is a different scenario. You'd create the app registration, they would consent, it all works. Same thing over here. Now, to kind of expand on this scenario, which is per customer and hosted, there's different ways to do this. I'm not at this point giving recommendations like this is the best way or whatever, but it is one. Here you can see that, well, we actually created app registration here. Is this possible where you can say, we have a service that we host here, it's an app service, but it could be, let's say, a virtual machine. And we want to dedicate this application instance or server instance to this customer. So one way you could do it is that the customer and their tenant creates the app registration, and then you configure it within your app service. Now, this would be something per customer hosted. There's ways to even make that dynamic, but anyhow. And then this app service runs. So, and then now that we have that, when the customer does go, log into the service, a consent will be required. That's in the customer's tenant, and the ways to control that. But again, let's say they say yes, and the application works. Now we have this URL that's for the customer, customer1.me-the-vendor.com. And now when they go to that URL and they log in, it's completely tied. So this would be one way of doing it per customer hosted. And on the customer side, they have full control of the app registration and the enterprise application, which means, that the vendor here still providing the service, still doing everything here. In that case, would they even need their Azure AD? No, they would not actually need their own Azure AD. So you could actually kind of take that out, because the service here is going, all identity authentication is happening at this level. Again, different ways, at this level. So different ways to architect that out. So this is one. And then you could do the same thing on this side of it, in this instance of it. So this is but one way. The more common way that you'll find that's out there is something like this. Now, in this instance, while I moved it up here, and really, actually, let me, give me a second, because I see that my fatal flaw in this particular part of it here. There we go. So this, nothing like building on the fly, huh? Is the same as this. Here we go. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, back on track. So in this particular instance, where we have, again, on the commercial side, this is the more common one, where we've done a lot of the commercials, some of the GCC High space. The vendor creates an app registration. One, they have an app service that they have, and they use it across n number of customers, which I'll show here again in a little bit. And when the customer goes to this website, right, they just go, they log in, they register, and then now they get redirected to the login link that says, hey, this application needs to get approval for consent. You've probably seen this. A lot of times the screen will come up and say user profile, very basic. Normally people leave it open. but now this application is doing, workflow backend things. Maybe it's even doing automation for some of your, conditional access policies. So you give it a lot of application permissions, whatever that is. Now you give consent. So now there is one application registration. There's one time it's configured in the app service, and each customer has to consent. Now, in this scenario here, again, we're keeping things pretty simple. So, we have in this area, we would do the same thing in commercial. And again, in this scenario, let's say, different data centers. Over here I'm running Azure Global. Over here I'm doing Azure Government. The vendor is doing this, as well as the customer. They have 2 environments, or maybe they only have 1. Anyhow, this is how we're doing it. Very simple. Run registration, 1 config, n number of consents by customers. For customer, they just do this. When this happens, the customer doesn't see anything in that registration. It doesn't exist because that's not where it's defined. It's defined in the customer space. Now, where this gets tricky is now what's happening in this space. Now we start talking about some real concerns and some security things is, well, now this one vendor, and by the way, you could be doing this as a your customer, you have this, and you're doing this for your end customers because there's some, part of your business, line of business applications that you're creating. So, you may not see yourself as an ISV or SaaS vendor, but you are because you're kind of doing it in this way. But anyhow, in here, there's one app registration that was created. There's consent across all of the customers. Now, how do they get access to this? Well, one, when there's authentication to the other one. So let's say somebody logs into the app service. We're not talking about background services just yet, but people log into the service. When they go to log in, it gets sent, to that. It's like, hey, you have to log in. Hit the login button. Goes to the Azure Government login. People put in their email address. They put in their password, MFA, token key, whatever. They get validated. So when it comes back, you're going to get a token back that essentially says, here's who this person is and what you need to go do. And now I can take that same token, and if I need to then pass that to the graph, which I've been scoped to go do, to perform the action on their behalf, I'll be allowed to go do that. Where this becomes tricky, where this becomes something to really think about is that, one of the consents that can happen is when we consent for 2 things, application access. And in that same consent, when we provide the scope screen, the scoping string, we put in offline_access in there. What that does is it's going to say, all right, again, the other party has a consent to it. There's a long chain of events. So I'm not going to go through all the details on this, but you're going to get a code and you're going to get a code that you converted to an access token and a refresh token. And because it was approved in the consent for the code the first time, when you exchange and ask it for the access token, by the way, this is a standard that's used all over in OAuth. If you see all these other places, when offline access is in there, it means that once it's approved in consent and the application gets it back, it gets an access token. Normally they live about 30 minutes and a refresh token. And what's kind of tricky in there is that there'll be a timeline that'll say, oh, it's normally only good for 30 minutes, except that refresh token, that original one that you get back, you can actually ask for another token with that same refresh token. The thing that's confusing is you normally would get back another refresh token. You kind of ignore that one. It's the original one that you get to keep asking for things. And this allows you, with that offline access, it means that anything that was in that scope with offline access, I can run on the background without any user having to log in. So it's good if you're going to do background processing, daemon work, things like that. But if that wasn't your intent, do not use that. So again, you can make those calls to say, hey, here's what I need, and the calls on behalf of the users. And then there's also the, hey, I want you to consent for this application, but I want to do stuff in the background. So one, from a management side, be mindful if you accept an application and it says offline access and you go, hold on, what are you doing in the background? You should only be doing things on behalf of the user, but that thing needs to be refreshed. I think typically it's about, I think it's 60 or 90 days that you'd have to actually go research and get another code and then go through that process. So it's something to be mindful of the upkeep for this type of thing. And even there, when you get that refresh token, and even with the client secret, this is something else to think about, because when I access those services, right, on the behalf, I also have to then say, hey, on the background, I'm going to go ahead and talk to this particular customer over here, it's not just a free thing, you go get it. You still have to provide what was the original URL or on my list and app registration that says it's okay. What's the the application access that I'm consuming, and it wants the secret or key, right? And the key really is the certificate. So you can do certificate or a secret. So what this means is that protecting the secret, because the same client ID, the same secret, I can then ask, like, remember I was talking about the refresh token, but I may want a new one. These two pieces, I can call and ask for it. I do have to tell it the tenant. So when you're doing this multi-tenant kind of environment, when people connect in, there's something called a state key or a state value, so that when I go when I'm saying, hey, this is a new customer signing up, the state value is like a GUID or 123, and I store in a database. So when it comes back to me, because it's not going to give me a lot of context, it's going to say, hey, we're good, and you got to look at the database. Here's my state key. Oh, this matches, so it's for that tenant, and now I know the tenant. So when I need to go ask for it again, I can. Now that's some background stuff you got to go do to go track it and keep track of that and whatever stores. But again, this one app registration, the client ID is the same across all of them, single one, and the secret that I have is used for all of them as well. So again, this one application, whether it's background or direct, has that information. So managing the client ID and secrets, having good rotation, putting it in the vault, keeping track of it is going to be super, super key. And also, that's why you don't want to have too much of a scope that you may not need. So this is something ISV has to do, same as doing the development that you have to go do. I know I don't show Azure Vault on here, but it's what you need to go do. So now let's continue with this particular scenario where, single application, multiple tenants that I'm going through. I'm doing a good job. I put things in Azure Vault. Now the question is, what about the data? So if now you're trying to meet FedRAMP High certification, there's they have their own laundry list of requirements that you have to have. Now we start to go on the part of, well, if I'm just doing something that's for HR onboarding, again, understanding what's UI data, if say, well, we just look at the SharePoint stuff. So we we use the, we want Teams that, read all, because, we need to do some background work, and the users that log in, they might have, even like an IT admin, could have access to, almost all of the SharePoint sites, sometimes not all of them, because they might have been carved out for some of the CUI data, which is common in a lot of compliance, not just GCC High, but other places as well. So you need another service that can access all of those things. Application access gives you all of that, which is awesome and frightening. So, you have to pay close attention to it. But now that you're accessing those things, now the next question is, if the function of my application is going to work with something that's CUI data or sensitive, should I be managing that for them? I can have a SQL, if I'm using some SQL or blob storage, I could say, yeah, I shred the data so that, and I multi-tenant the data. But there might be times when you actually want to create multiple instances of like Azure SQL or storage to isolate towards the customer and make sure the application can only connect to those databases when the right application instance for the customer is running. So I'm not going to go into that part, but knowing where to store things. So that's really kind of a business decision for you and for the customer to understand where should it be stored. Now, you could have it to where people log in, they're doing it, and they give you a connection point in their Azure tenant for them to store, the Azure SQL or blob storage that you could write into. You could have this same client ID have some access into that, but now we're talking about all kinds of service principals and storing and tokens. But this job ain't easy, and the scenarios are tough, especially when you're talking about compliance, failure, and passing the legal requirements, all those things, data access, data infiltration. So it's not easy, but you're doing CUI data or more, so you have to really take that into consideration. So if you're just doing login, you can say, hey, I just want to do login and nothing else. But again, it's like, well, what is the service that you need? So that's not for me to determine. It's for you all. So again, something there to really kind of be mindful of. So some of this I covered already, but again, in the scoping that you have in the string, when you first do your registration, again, putting offline access, one, as a consumer of this, be mindful, ask questions. The second is, do you need it for that? You could create a separate app registration that's specific for background tasks, and another one that's more specific for people that are doing things. Now, if you're an ISV, an application means you're going to have multiple enterprise applications. That's not bad, and it gives focus of who can do it, what it can do, and you can track it a little bit more granular. So, I wouldn't say you'd want to have like 8 or 10 of these things, but it's not uncommon to see more than 2 for one vendor and application. So that one is specific for like batch jobs, background processing, so you can track it. You can, that app registration turns to service principal, so you can also secure what it does in particular places, so it's not so wide open, and still leave the delegate access one for the app registration more for the users that log in and do things under their context as you need to. So again, something to take a look at. On the security side, and this, I'm going to go back to the scenario because there's a couple more things I wanted to go through, and then we'll get to our Q&A. There's, once you're doing this app registration and you're managing things, there are additional capabilities that you can code into your application that essentially fires off signals to, like, let's say, conditional access. So if somebody is performing an action, regular stuff, and now that person is going to do something that's a kind of more sensitive action, deleting data, maybe it's an approval of something, you can actually say, hey, I'm going to fire off to conditional access that this is a highly sensitive activity. And if your code has that and raises that signal and alert, conditional access can be made aware of it. So that way you can say, hey, this application should be used everywhere, except when it's a high privileged thing that the application is determined and kicks off that signal. When that happens, I want to MFA them again. They've already logged in, but one more time isn't going to hurt them. So you can define that as an administrator if the application has been documented and supported to do that type of thing. So yet another set of controls where you can provide that connection, and then making sure that we do this for all of our customers that we do in GCC High, of making sure Azure AD log diagnostics. I think it's called diagnostic settings, but it goes into log analytics because it only stores it for about 31 days, I believe, of activities. You want it a lot longer. One, you need that for the audit, and two, because you're going to want those specifics of what's happening in the application. What do people log in? Where are they logging? Where are they logging in from? And then the application can even extend that and provide more details into log analytics, but that's a whole nother talk. But having this integration does a few things. One, if you have an application that you really want to integrate with Azure AD, there's so many great benefits. I know it feels like I'm talking about all the bummer stuff, but this is the things that's hard. And what are the areas that we have to look at just to have that conversation about it? And the one area that I wanted to make sure that we talked about was, going back to this scenario, could I have it where I'm an ISV or an application? Again, this works for both internal and internal apps and ISVs. Maybe I have the service and I invested so much in a deployment process, storage, and architecture that's load balanced in other places. Do I really have to put that into GCC High? Well, I'm not going to be the judge and jury on this. So I'm just going to talk to you about the capabilities. No, you don't have to. Right? You don't have to at all, except for a couple pieces. One, if you're going to have people in this space here in the GCC High instance and be able to consent to use their application, yes, you're going to have a client ID over here, even though your application doesn't reside here, because you still need to have a client registration. You still need to have a tenant for them to authorize. Now, once you have that, the Azure Active Directory, when you're logging in, it doesn't check like, hey, is that server running in Azure Government? Because maybe it was in AWS Government. Maybe it was on-prem, super secure, great stuff that you wanted to have. And and the data that you have isn't going to violate any CUI. So you would do it here. And in here in your app service, there's a couple of ways that you can go do it. One is you could branch off a separate segment of servers and go, hey, this way we can just have the same deployment of servers, but in the config, in the web.config or the JSON files for it, we can tell it that this bank of servers, which has a different, maybe gov.myapplication.com, and this one's just myapplication.com. But when people log into this one, we connect it to our tenant. So this way, those app registrations just work. We just run in a different environment, but all the authentication works. Azure AD is over here. It's fine. You want to think about some background networking here and stuff, but that's another thing. So that could work. What if I just wanted to have one that could do it? You could do it, but it's a little harder to do with some of the built-in tools that some of the Microsoft Identity has. Maybe you're using something else, Shibboleth or whatever that can handle, or Identity Server that can handle that for you. It's up to your architecture that understands when people come in, but you do need to decipher it somehow, right? So maybe because they go to agileIT.myapplication.com, I go, oh, when they go to that URL, I can see it, check my database, and know that's a government endpoint. I shoot them over there. So you may have to make adjustments in your applications, but you could have one service here that's running in this background. It's just on Azure. But when we know the person that has it, we need to log them in or consent that we're firing off to the kind of global the government world. But then again, if you're providing a service that is more generic, not CUI based, again, you'd have to really consider it. But you're providing services into the government space, you could still do that. But you would still need this tenant, right? And we've worked with several customers that did it that way. So you can go do that. If you are going to store some sensitive data or possibly get in there, then you probably want to be, in this particular space. You can still handle multiple deployments. I want the same code base going to both, and so you can still have good CI/CD process from Azure DevOps or GitHub that pushes it into both. So you keep your code base sync. It's just they know when the automated pipeline pushes to one over here, we use the gov one. When we do over here, we use the commercial one, and we can still have consistency. But we have two different tenants, two different storage types, two different client IDs. So you have to get in mind. In a later webinar, we'll talk about more security around these things. How would you manage this? How you detect this? How you control this? As well as other recommendations in terms of how would you operate in this type of environment. But for now, we thought that this would be a session to kind of get people going to understand that you can't just wire up just the endpoint. You are going to need a tenant. You are going to need this, but you can determine what you want to store, where you want to store it, and for whom you want to store it, which is a whole other discussions. Love to talk to you about it. So with that, let me just here we go. So we talked about this, some concerns. And again, just kind of summing it up here is that, the planning for this, understanding the consent flow, especially when you're doing it with GCC High and your commercial, to understand the differences of it. Where does it go? How do I store it? The multi-tenant one of it is, I think, really key for ISVs to go, hey, wait a minute, I can actually do that and make that easier to handle it. One question that can kind of come in is, well, I have things like, cross-tenant collaboration, which is supposed to make it easier between multiple tenants to share things. This has nothing to do with that. They're like completely different worlds than what you would go do with that. Can you make them work? Yes, but that's not really the point of this conversation. Most of it is this consent flow with OAuth and against the different tenants. Being able to understand your secrets, how it's managed, when it's used, where does it go to, controlling those endpoints. That's something that needs a lot of consideration, because the last thing you want to do is leak any of that and have people be able to access it. It's not as easy as just, well, hey, if somebody just gets it, they can go. There's more information that you would need. You can control where it's used. So in the app registration, what endpoints would be allowed to request it, come back. So there's good controls that help go through that. Proper planning, testing, validation is key to make that work. And for those that one of the things is when you're doing the scopes is your application or service could provide lots of benefits. You have plan 1, plan 2, plan 3, capabilities 1, capability 2. So you don't want to ask for all scopes because you're doing too much. They didn't need to buy that, or it's not ready for that. And you can consent for something and go, I want these 3 scopes. And now when that service is ready, or somebody buys a plan, or if it's used for that in that view, you can do a reconsent and get scopes added on. So you can do that as you move along. So, constrict for what you need, keep track of it, and go do that. And lastly, when you're doing things from single app to multiple apps, there are some changes in terms of the URL that you pass for the login, where instead of doing the domain, login/domain, it's going to be log/common, because you're going to say, hey, this could be anybody. But now you have to be able to keep track on your end the tenants that you've approved of, because you're going to need that ID and map to the service when you make the call for the tokens and more information. So there's more that goes into it. It's actually some really good content and starter kits for Microsoft. I don't have that here and there, but if you're in this space and you're looking to get into it, we'd love to help you out here at Agile IT and both help in getting the license. There's things where, hey, if I go into this, do I have to buy all the Microsoft 365 expensive licensing? The answer is no, you don't. But there's a few licenses you should have to make sure that the right security and access is being had when you are accessing it, when your partners or vendors or support people are accessing it. So because you still need to get audited and control that kind of stuff. That was not the purpose of this discussion, but more things we can help out. So with that, hopefully this gave you at least some insight and some things to consider. There's so much to go into this. I was going to show like all the URL paths, but I'm like, there'd be no time, to go through it. So this will have to squeeze in kind of the first. So we're going to have subsequent sessions that goes a little bit deeper on this. If we're already planning it, but if you have other requests in the community, please send it through, and we'd love to talk with you and continue to share it. So with that, I think we'd be able to open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Conrad. We are going to keep recording. For those of you watching on YouTube, there will be a link to register for our next webinar down below in the comments. So feel free to join if you want to come and be part of the Q&A. But right now, I'm going to go ahead and open up the microphones.